All right, so the cipher that I chose for my project was the Rosetta Stone, which the Rosetta Stone was a stone slab discovered in ancient Egypt that was, or discovered from the era of ancient Egypt, that was covered in three distinct languages. The three distinct languages were Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian Demotic, and ancient Greek. The stone helped Egyptologists and historians decipher the confusing hieroglyphs of Egypt. Throughout the many years that Egypt was kind of dug up and discovered many tombs, and from the Great Pyramids, many hieroglyphs were found inside of these tombs, and many could only guess at what their true meanings were before they discovered the Rosetta Stone, which helped them decipher the other language, decipher the hieroglyphics. So it was founded in the 19th century by the French army under Napoleon Bonaparte during their occupation of Egypt and the majority of northern Africa. It was discovered in the city of modern-day Rashid, or Rosetta, while they were repairing a fort in the city. They found it while they were doing demolition and blasting through several walls of the old fort that was there for many years before the French occupied the land. However, it was taken by the British Army in, I believe, 1801 after the defeat of the French forces in the region, and it was taken and shipped back to London, where it has stayed since then in the British Museum. So, like I mentioned before, on the stone there were three distinct languages, and the languages were by a decree of the pharaoh at the time, Ptolemy V, which the decree was officially from 196 BC, and it was a decree mostly saying that he was a great ruler and how amazing and glorious he was. I believe at the time Ptolemy V was, like, I believe barely 18, if that, when he ruled. Like I said before, the three different languages on it were hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek, and it had been, as I mentioned before, a mystery for many historians to decipher hieroglyphics due to the fact that the language died out around the 4th century, and many Egyptians stopped using hieroglyphics after the 4th century because of the fall of the Roman Empire, and other conquering forces of the region kind of discouraged the use of the language in Egypt. So the format of the stone was that there were the three different languages kind of layered on top of each other. The first was hieroglyphics, then the Demotic, then the Greek. These three languages were some of the most common in Egypt at the time. Hieroglyphics were used by priests for religious purposes and religious documents, such as burials in tombs or coffins, and stuff like that. Demotic was the most common language used in Egypt. It was like the common script of the people. It's kind of like hieroglyphics were kind of cursive, and Demotic was normal English. Like normal, just written English. And Greek was spoken by majority of the rulers of Egypt at the time, because Greek was a very common language throughout the Mediterranean after the many conquering forces of both the Romans and the Greeks and all the other stuff like that. So how it was deciphered it was deciphered over many, many decades by a lot of different people. But they started out by deciphering the Greek language by using similar Latin terms and other modern languages that were easy to decipher the Greek language. At the time that the stone was discovered, much of Greek was already deciphered, or they guessed at what the meanings were, and they could cross-reference it with the Latin and the Roman languages that they had found, because they were very similar and very similar to English and other Germanic languages of the area. Next, they moved on to the Demotic, which was a relatively simple language once you could figure out the symbolic meanings of the text. And Demotic is very similar to modern-day Arabic languages, very similar typescript with subtle differences. However, to decipher the hieroglyphics, it would take many decades of work by two men named Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion. And these were two very intelligent guys that would take on kind of the task of beginning to decipher and find keys to the hieroglyphics with the help of the Rosetta Stone and its other languages. So Thomas Young focused on what was called cartouches, which were oval symbols that enclosed pieces of hieroglyphics. What you'll see in a picture later is I have a picture of certain hieroglyphic phrases that are circled in this oval around them. What Thomas Young discovered is that the cartouches enclosed royal names such as Ptolemy and later Cleopatra and other royal names or people of high power. And Thomas Young believed that hieroglyphics, unlike Demotic, was a strictly symbolic language. Demotic was a language that comprised of both sounds and symbolic phrases. And it was very much believed that it was kind of one of the few languages and one of the only languages that was like it. And many Egyptologists and historians believe that the nature of hieroglyphics made it strictly a symbolic language, since it was all pictures and hieroglyphic pictographs, stuff like that. However, in the early 19th century, around 1920s, he put aside the project of studying the stone for other things. He just kind of stopped studying it. He didn't really give up. He just stopped. No one really knows why. However, the person to take up the study of the Rosetta Stone was Jean-Francois Champollion, and he took it up after Young around the same time that Young kind of stopped. And he discovered that he could use this technique of this cross-referencing to compare names with the cartouches found on the stone to fill in gaps of hieroglyphics. Like I said earlier, he used names such as Ptolemy and Cleopatra that were kind of foreign names to where the stone was discovered, and Cleopatra and Ptolemy weren't necessarily Egyptian, so they weren't true hieroglyphics that made up the names, because Cleopatra and both Ptolemy were Latin-derived names with Greek backgrounds. Using this cross-referencing technique, however, by cross-referencing the names with stuff on the stone and hieroglyphs and words on the stone, he was able to make a full working hieroglyphic alphabet, but he made another discovery with the name of Ramses. He discovered that the name of Ramses, which is a very common name in Egypt and much of the Mediterranean, it was a name made up of both symbols and corresponding sounds in hieroglyphic, and he decided to apply the same technique that made Ramses able to be pronounced, and he applied it to other words and other hieroglyphs. And he figured out that using this technique that he could discover that hieroglyphs were both a symbolic script that contained also conceptual symbols and phonetic signs. So these are the pictures for references. And as you can see here, they use these circles. Let me change the color real quick. These circles right here, these are the cartouches that they were talking about earlier. He discovered that these cartouches only circled main names of high political figures or pharaohs and stuff like that, and he used that for his cross-referencing techniques and changing the other words. This picture over here on the right is kind of just a layout of the stone again. So like here on top where the hieroglyphs, here is the Demotic, and here you can see like just how different the two languages are, even though they were both in the same country. And then this is the Ancient Greek. Ancient Greek is very similar to modern Greek, just with very subtle differences added in with Latin characters and such. So thanks to the work of both Jean and Thomas, they were able to figure out how to break the code of the Rosetta Stone by cross-referencing and finding keys in stuff like the cartouches and comparing them to names and symbols and comparing those symbols to the other languages, and were able to make a lot of guesses and educated guesses to making a full alphabet that eventually turned into the rediscoverance of hieroglyphics and the importance of the language. And that is all. Thank you.